And welcome to our special joint webinar today, a 650 Traliant joint webinar, Making Risk Management as Easy as 1, 2, 3. My name is Ryan Parker. I'm the Chief Legal Officer at 650. And if you haven't heard of 650, we're the legal technology subsidiary of the law firm Wilson Sonsini. And we take legal expertise and thoughtful technology and bring them together to help companies to comply with complex legal frameworks. And in particular, today we're going to be talking about employment policies and employee handbooks. And we have a tool that helps companies to develop employment policies and employee handbooks. And so we'll be drawing on some of that expertise today. We're thrilled to have with us on this webinar Andrew Rawson, who is a co-founder of Traliant. Traliant makes some of the best training that we have seen, and Andrew can tell you more about that during the presentation. But we're really excited for what we think is a real natural pairing of our policy engines and Traliant's outstanding training programs. We also have Adrian Jack with us today. Adrian is a vice president of legal product at 650. And also a frequent presenter on 650 webinars. So we're excited to have Adrian with us. Before we launch just right into the webinar, let me just take care of a couple of housekeeping matters. One, we would welcome your questions. We ask that you put them into the Q&A at the bottom of the page so that we can track them. We'll try to answer some of them during the course of the webinar, and we may save some of those questions for the Q&A at the end, but feel free to put your questions in there. You can also make comments in the chat, but it's easier for us to track questions in the Q&A. Before we start, I'll answer the question that we always get at every webinar. Will you send out the slides? The answer is yes. At the end of the webinar, sometime in the next day or two, we'll send you a follow-up email that has all of the slides so that you can have those at your disposal. We're really looking forward to the program today. And with that, I'm going to hand it over to Andrew, who's going to start our presentation.
Well, thanks, Ryan. So let's flip over to the next slide, please. And Traliant is, we've been in business about 6 years now. And our tagline from the beginning was take your compliance training from boring to brilliant. And we'll touch on it's a great tagline because it sounds great, but then we'll go one layer deeper and talk about how we do that and why the partnership with 650 is so critical for getting your training and your policies integrated. So the three key areas of risk management, which is really what compliance training is all about, whether it's required by law or not, you're still at the end of the day managing risk, are prevention of discrimination and harassment, diversity, equity, and inclusion, and data privacy and information security. And prevention of discrimination and harassment, the way to think about that is that's kind of what you must or must not do. That's covered by that. Those are mostly covering the federal laws and as well as state and some city laws as well about protected classes and appropriate and inappropriate behavior. So that's what you have to do. Diversity, equity, inclusion is kind of the proverbial other side of the coin, and that's what you should do, right? You want to have a diverse, equitable, and inclusive workplace. This is these are the things you should do to have that type of organization. And when it comes to diversity, equity, and inclusion, the training is really a critical part of it because you can make an organization diverse just by executive fiat and making sure you hire people that represent a diverse cross-section of American society. But you can't really make it inclusive unless your people buy into it. And we'll go into more of that in a few minutes. So I guess the summary of this slide is it's really about taking these areas of risk and how you can turn them into opportunities, why you should, frankly, turn them into opportunities. Next slide, please. So this is one of those terrible slides in the sense that's terrible in the sense that it's text rich, and then I say I'm not going to read it all, and then I'm going to talk over it, and then you're trying to read it while I'm talking. So I apologize for the disconnect. But the key point here, it takes those three critical areas of prevention, discrimination, harassment, diversity, equity, inclusion, or DEI, and data privacy and information technology, and just and you're going to get these slides, but talks about the risks of not doing it and the opportunities of doing it. And they're fairly substantial. You know, people ask about the ROI on some of this training, and it's tough to calculate because, you know, the training is generally, for the most part, it costs less per person than their hourly rate. And what's the cost of not being on the front page of your local paper as having a sexual harassment or discrimination suit brought against you? So the returns can be off the chart, but I'll let you read this when you get the actual deck. Next, please.
Andrew, I'll jump in just on that slide.
Yeah.
Before coming to 650, I worked at the Department of Justice, and I actually defended different types of discrimination claims in front of the EEOC and in federal court. And it always struck me as an attorney how disruptive those kind of cases were as we took depositions and as we had to collect information, and how expensive those were, both in terms of man hours, but also just reputation and goodwill among employees. I'll also add that one thing that we've seen lately is that in this tight labor market, it's important that you have the right cultural components at your company to be able to keep the talent that you attract. And I think DEI is in particular an aspect of that has become more important. And I think rightly so, as people want to work in diverse and inclusive environments. And so, one part of that return of investment, I think, is the ability to retain talent in what is, I think, a very competitive labor market. And so I do think the interesting thing here, as you talk about ROI, is that some of these things may be hard to balance on a balance sheet, but there are clear and very important benefits to not only sort of protecting against risk, but also affirmatively creating the kind of culture and environment that you need to be successful as a company and to retain, your greatest resource, which is in almost all cases the talent that you have at your company.
No, Ryan, that's an excellent point. I will say that in working with some large public companies over the last couple of years, it's amazing how focused they are on making sure that their recruiting pages, their career pages, all stress how focused they are on having diverse, equitable, and inclusive place to work, particularly with younger people entering the workforce. They're really concerned, and it's been a seller's market, if you will, for jobs, and the people out there selling themselves have had the luxury of being able to pick and choose between organizations, and many candidates do really care. And if someone asks you, what do you do about diversity, equity, inclusion? Just having the training that you train people on, your new hires, your existing people, but the people on this webcast, I'm confident when you take the training, you'll become a little more familiar with the lexicon, a little more comfortable with the lingo, and just being able to discuss that in a positive way will really help with your recruiting as well as your making people internally feel good as well. So that was good. Thanks, Ryan. Next slide, please. So if you believe that those three key areas are important, we want you to get excited about the solution, because not only will we show you why we think our training is demonstrably more interesting and more engaging than anything else on the market, but integrated with 650, where you can get your policies in there, that's really a super important to effectiveness. We believe that if you're not careful and a leader goes out there and talks about, we really want to have a diverse, equitable, and inclusive workforce, and you make this big statement, you follow it up with buying off-the-shelf training that you bought with a credit card on the internet, and send that out, it kind of can backfire, because you're really saying, yeah, I know I told you this was important, but you're really not showing people it's important, right? Don't tell me you love me, show me you love me. And that's not showing people you love them. It's not matching. We talk about the tone from the top. We help you align the tone with the top with the deed from the top, and certainly creating your policies or updating them through 650, and then we make it easy to integrate those into the actual training. That sends a very positive message to your workforce and candidates, and I think you'll find that be very well received by your colleagues.
And Andrew, I'll just jump in and say that I think that both policies and training are more important now, maybe than they have been in the past, with our more remote and diffused workforces, right? Where we have, at least in our company, we have people working all across the country in different states, many people who are not together for uh, and don't have opportunities for group in-person training, and also are not just down the hall from their from our HR person, right? So when they have a question, they're looking at our employee handbook. They're thinking about the training that they took. And I really think that training and the policies are a critical way of not only making sure that you have the right culture in your company, but also sort of establishing who you're going to be as a company in a time where people aren't having as much of the interpersonal interaction. They're not learning from seeing like they maybe would in an office environment where everyone is coming into the same office all the time.
No, that's true. And the other thing that we've learned is we've morphed the training over the last 18, 24 months to include information from managers on keeping a sharp eye out for examples of harassment or discrimination that can happen, over Zoom meetings, over video calls, because people are not always on the best behavior. They're when you commute to the office and you go in there, you're aware you're in different surroundings, but at home sometimes people aren't always their best selves. So we do address that in the training as well. Next slide, please. So if you said, what's the one thing that makes the training that you can get from 650 different than anything else out there? It's these 5 points. This is what we've learned. This is why we're number 234 on the Inc. 500 list for 2021, is because these 5 points are the foundation that all of our training is built on. And the first point is that knowledge transfer does not correlate to behavior. And that's kind of a fancy way of saying is just because someone knows what to do doesn't mean they're going to do it. I'm confident Andrew Cuomo got 100% on his sexual harassment prevention training course, right? Just because you know you shouldn't do something doesn't mean you're not going to do it. Number one. Number two is because of that, we teach people how to behave. We don't train on the law. One of the criticisms of traditional compliance training and why it's so boring and horrible is they teach you the penalty. Well, it could be up $125,000 fine. That's not going to stop somebody from harassing or discriminating against somebody the size of the fine. So by teaching on behavior, and by the way, so the natural question is, you teach behavior. How do you teach behavior? We teach people behavior by showing the consequences of right and wrong behavior. What happens if you're a bystander and you see somebody be discriminated against in your organization? What happens if you speak up? What happens if you don't? And equally important, what's the right way to speak up, right? I mean, you can't go to your boss's boss's boss and call them out in front of everybody. That's not practical nor realistic. But we go through real world examples and teach people how to behave. The third point is that finger wagging doesn't work, right? No one likes that. Children, adults, dogs, nobody likes to have, you better do this or else, is a completely ineffective way of communicating with your fellow human being. And we do believe that only by holding up a mirror to people's behavior and saying, look, here's what happens if you do intervene. Here's what happens if you do say that, so you don't say that. Then having them reflect on their choices, you're most likely to have the kind of impact you want if you show people the consequences of their behavior. And the fifth point, or the fourth point is people remember stories, not facts. The reason graphs are powerful as opposed to rows and columns of data is graphs are stories, right? It's getting better over time. It's getting worse over time. So we are at our heart storytellers, and every time we can, every video in our trainings, they're always stories because that's what you remember. And that's a critical part of what makes our training so much different than anything else, what makes it interesting. And finally, one of the worst criticisms of compliance training in general is that it insults your intelligence. Just give me the test. I'm sure everyone on this webcast today has taken compliance training, either a little or a lot in their careers. And how terrible it is when you say, just give me the test. I don't need to take this. So we never ask questions that are so obvious you don't need to take the training to answer. And in fact, sometimes something comes up that you think is bad, and then you think about it and you realize it's really good. And in our case, that example is at the beginning, people would sometimes email us or call and say, hey, question number 6, you say the answer is A. We have people that think it's B, and here's why. And at first I was like, oh, gee, it's terrible. Well, we got to check what's wrong. And then I realized that's great because we made you care. So that's a wonderful thing that people actually care about the answers and they're nuanced, and that's what makes it engaging and interesting. So these are the 5 pillars on which our training is based, and everything we do is based on this and these core principles.
Yeah, and just like the principles of training, I feel like there are similar principles for employment policies, and that's what we think about is what are the considerations that companies need to be thinking about when they go to implement an employment policy, especially in these key areas of risk like discrimination or harassment, in protection of information, as well as in diversity, equity, inclusion. Those are all areas that 650 has a key focus on. And so I'd love to jump to the next slide and we can talk about what are these same principles when it comes to creating employment policies. What are companies thinking about? What are some best practices that we've seen as we create employment policies that are adaptable and flexible, but can apply to companies of different sizes and industries and location? So when it comes to creating employment policies, the first step is to assess the goal. What are companies trying to accomplish? And when it comes to equal opportunity policies and sexual harassment, the goal is more clear, is they're trying to prevent these from occurring in the workplace. And that's a great place to start. But other policies, the answer is not so clear. It's what is the company trying to encourage a certain kind of behavior? Are they trying to prevent a kind of behavior, or are they just preparing for a worst case scenario? If something were to go awry at the company, they have a way to discipline an employee or a paper trail to document that the company is complying with laws. And so understand what is the policy trying to accomplish is very important before even getting to creating a policy, because that's the most important first step. And it's also impacted by the company's cultures and values. Is how do we, what are our goals here at our company, and how do those affect the policies that we have that govern workplace behavior and expectations? So once the goal is determined, the next step is knowing when to implement a policy and when not to implement a policy. Not every situation needs an employment policy. When it comes to equal opportunity policies and sexual harassment, those are fundamental policies that we see almost every company implementing, because those laws are important and they set the infrastructure for the workplace culture and ensuring a safe and inclusive workplace. And so those are foundational policies, but then you start to build from there of what are some other policies that companies are implementing. During remote working, we saw companies implementing a lot of different kinds of policies that maybe aren't as encouraged, that aren't as required by law. So we saw companies implementing video conferencing policies affecting what employees should do when using video conferencing technologies. That's not a required policy, but companies felt like it was the right time to implement that policy. And when to implement a policy is really a fact-specific question, depending on the company size, the company culture, and what's going on. But we see a lot of companies that say, do we need this policy or do we not need this policy? And the answer is a typical lawyer answer. Well, it depends. What is the issue that you're facing and what is the goal that you're trying to accomplish? And so when it comes to those questions, we say, well, how do your employees know what their expectations are? Do they understand how they're expected to act or what requirements they're expected to meet? And if they know that without a policy, maybe, depending, you don't need a policy in place. But sometimes employees say, we get a lot of questions, HR might say, we get a lot of questions about this issue. Like, do employees have to have their video camera on during video conferencing calls? Does the company require that? Do they not require that? We get a lot of questions. And so if employees are asking questions about an issue, that might mean that the company needs to clarify it, either through a policy or through other means. And so when it comes to those types of issues, a policy can help. Even a policy that says cameras are not required on video conferencing calls or on internal conferencing calls, whatever the company policy is, having that clearly outlined takes a lot of apprehension off of employees, because they know what I'm doing meets the company expectations. And that applies to other issues as well, like privacy, diversity, equity, inclusion. What does the company expect? And is it the appropriate time to implement a policy? The next big question is, what are the applicable laws and regulations? And this is something that we at 650 tackle head on. We look at all the 50 state employment laws. What are the differences in the jurisdictions? How do they vary? What are the flex points of determining when a certain law applies or when it does not? And that's what our employee handbook tool does, is it looks at these laws and regulations and can tell you when a law applies to you and when it does not, based on company answers to certain questions. And these laws vary by, I'm sure as companies have expanded their workforce and dispersed across many states, they vary so much. Even within a state, there can be county and city laws that are triggered based on different employee headcount thresholds and other considerations. And these laws aren't just, they're not just varied, they're also rapidly changing. We saw at least 76 statewide employment laws go into effect in 2022. And so for companies with employees in multiple states, that's a lot to track and to keep in compliance with. And so not just knowing the laws, but also being prepared to track and follow changes to the law is important. And we recommend that companies have a point person to do that, and they either utilize current service providers or utilize new service providers like 650 that can help them track changes in the law so that they know when to implement those in their handbook to make sure they're staying compliant. Another big question is, how does the company operate? If a policy is overly aspirational and doesn't really reflect how employees are currently acting or have acted over the company's long history, that's not an effective policy. If the company wants to change employee behavior, as Andrew said, you need to demonstrate that behavior and give a standard of what is expected for employees. And just writing it into a policy is not going to change employee behavior. So that's where the training component can be crucial, is showing employees how to act, teaching them what the desired behavior is, rather than just writing it in a policy that's really not going to change anything. And outdated policies can actually be very detrimental to a company. They can be confusing to employees if they see one thing in the handbook or an employment policy and another behavior in the workplace. That's confusing, and it discredits all of the company policies. If they say, well, the handbook doesn't really, we don't really follow the handbook, that could discredit other policies that the company does follow or that takes very seriously. And so having an updated and accurate employee handbook or employment policies is critical for companies' operations and for good employee morale, for employee clarity on expectations. And heaven forbid, if there's litigation down the road, having an accurate handbook can be a great asset to a company, or it can be very damaging evidence against a company if it's not updated. And then once a company has a policy in place, the next step is to communicate that policy to employees. Having it in place doesn't really do much until you communicate that to employees and help them understand, why was this policy implemented? And for some, this step might not be necessary. I think employees all understand why there's a sexual harassment policy in place at a company, but for other policies, the company might want to communicate, just so you know, employees, we implemented a video conferencing policy. We get a lot of questions about it. We wanted to clarify some of the issues. And so communicating that to employees can help employees understand, oh, the company's trying to answer questions rather than the company's trying to have a heavy hand on our behavior or micromanage us. It communicates the why to employees, which can help increase buy-in for employment policies. And then make sure there's an open door for employees to ask questions about the policies that have been implemented. And then finally, once a policy is implemented and communicated, prepare to enforce it. If a policy is out there and it expects a certain kind of behavior, the company should plan ahead. How are we going to enforce violations of this policy? Does the policy communicate what happens if employees don't follow the policy? And then how are we implementing this in practice? And this is where training, as Andrew has indicated, is crucial. You're training managers, supervisors, and other employees on how the company will enforce the policy and what supervisors should do in situations where they're supervising employees who might be violating a company policy. Because supervisors don't know this just from reading a policy. Is what are the company expectations around enforcement of policies, and any steps in that process are should be communicated and outlined before there's a violation. Because if a company is selectively enforcing policies, or maybe there's a policy that's been in the handbook for years that employees have been violating, and then suddenly selectively enforces it, a policy that's kind of been dormant, that can lead to employment discrimination. And we've seen that in so many employment law cases where a policy that just applies to one employee, maybe opens the door for discrimination claims. And so making sure that enforcement is consistent across the workforce, it's planned for in advance, it's effectively documented. These can all help ensure a robust policy and a really happy employee workplace.
You know, one thing that I'll just jump in that I think is a key point that both Andrew and Adrian have made is aligning expectations, right? I mean, you have employee expectations and you have the employer expectations. And I think that the policies and the training are really your vehicles to make sure that you're on the same page, because where you often run into trouble is where employees don't understand the expectations and they do things that don't meet their employer's expectations. And then there are discipline actions or there are other issues. And I really do think that sort of understanding how to align those expectations through, you know, clear written policies that can be understood by employees and through effective training that really brings home what the company's expecting, it is really essential to managing that employer-employee relationship.
You know, this is all excellent stuff. This is really, I mean, I hope everybody can see the value of when you look at the things that Adrian are talking about here and Ryan, why you do all these things and then you integrate it into the training and you've got a really powerful message and a serious message to your coworkers. So let's go to the next slide. So in the world of preventing discrimination and harassment, there's been some cultural shifting just over the past couple of years. The bullet points on the left there are all the general topics that are covered in the training. Bystander intervention was generally not covered in this type of training until about 3 years ago. It became apparent that it really came out of Harvey Weinstein. This, by the way, here's a good example. I'm going to tell you the story and you're all going to remember the story because it's a story. When the Harvey Weinstein story broke in October of 2017, Quentin Tarantino came forward and said, I feel terrible because I knew he was doing these terrible things and I didn't say anything to anybody. And what became apparent was that this training is not going to stop the Harvey Weinsteins of the world from their illegal and horrid behavior. So if you can't stop the psychopaths, then maybe you can have people come forward and report things. So it was really after Quentin Tarantino came forward, which is late 2017, 2018, that we adapted the training to add bystander intervention that talked about, because frequently these things do get witnessed, and instead of having people look at their shoes and saying, thank God that's not me, we teach people how to intervene. That's an important way the training's evolved in recent years. The other thing in the first statement on the top there, stopping discriminatory and harassing behavior is critical to creating a culture of inclusion, respect, and civility. Civility is an important word. Civility to us means it's not the legal stuff, meaning if you're incivil, you didn't do stuff that's illegal, but I like to think of incivility as the gateway drug to harassment and discrimination. If you allow incivil behavior in your organization, you're really heading down a bad road. So we do teach civility in our training, and we think that's a really important thing because we want people to do it. We want people to model the right behaviors because of the right behaviors, not simply say, well, it's not illegal to do this, so I can do that. You know, they're not a member of a protected class, so I can really make comments about their dress or their looks. So it's really civility is a key part of the training as well. Next slide.
And Andrew, I'll just jump in there
Please.
as an attorney. A lot of times I've seen court cases, and there's actually a famous court case where the court says the federal anti-discrimination laws are not a civility code or for the workplace. And so there are things that maybe are not enforced by the courts that can have just terrible damaging effects on your company culture, on your retention, and on individuals. And so I really do think that area of civility, it's sort of the conduct that doesn't quite rise to the level of actionable discrimination under discrimination laws, but is completely inappropriate and corrosive to your activity, is to your company, I think is a crucial thing to address. And I'm glad you touched on that.
Yeah, no, I agree. Corrosive is the right word. It's corrosive when you have an incivil workplace. There's some other places we touch on that as well. All right, next slide, please. So this is a trick slide. this slide is trick slide. It's prepared by lawyers. Just making fun of you guys a little bit because I'm not a lawyer. That says these are the states in blue that have laws that require training on sexual harassment or discrimination or both. And the reason it's a trick slide is because let's say that somebody works in New York City, which also that happens to be a city law, but they live in New Jersey, but they're working from home. So are they no longer covered by actually, my example is bad. It's the other way around. They live in New York and they work in New Jersey, but now they're working from home. So now at what point, how many days do they have to work from home in New York before they're subject to the New York training laws? I think the answer is not a legal one, but just a practical one. Do you really want to find out? So we routinely, Adobe is one of our clients, and they have 22,000 workers around the world, and they have a ton in New York and a ton in California, which each have their own. One has a time-based training law, one has a curriculum-based training law, and they said, you know what? We don't want to worry about whether somebody's been, went to New York for 3 days and now they're covered by the New York law or California, or whether they're a manager. So we're training everybody on a consolidated course that covers New York and California. So the reason it's so it's a trick slide in that it's not so simple to say, well, I'm in Iowa, so I'm not covered by any state laws. Going back to the concept of the title of this webcast about risk management, whether you're even if you're in Wyoming, you're not adjacent to any state. I would tell you this, that again, I'm not an attorney, but I've been doing this for a long time. And I will tell you, when a worker files a complaint with the local Equal Employment Opportunity Office, the first thing they do is the EEOC calls you up, comes in. First thing they want to see is your training records. Now there's no federal law requiring you to do it, but that's when I've spoken to the EEOC investigators. They said that's their first indication of how serious a company is about preventing discrimination and harassment. And to Adrian's point earlier about you can't just whip out your policy and say, here, we have this policy. We emailed it to everybody 2 years ago. You didn't train on it. There's even a famous Supreme Court case about that. But you don't want to, while yes, there are training requirements on these states, you don't want to just simply say, well, I'm not in that state. I'm not required to train on it, because you really, you don't mitigate the risk of having a problem. Next slide, please.
Well, and Andrew,
Yes.
as lawyers will tell you, the legal answer about what is the bare minimum requirement isn't a best practice most of the time, right? Like, just because you're meeting the bare minimum, the law is to give you, road parts on the road to tell you when you've gone too far. And that doesn't mean you should get as close to the edge as you can get before you're off the road. You should stay, that's the FAR guideline, but you want to stay in a best practice area, which is training your entire workforce or teaching your employees about these issues, rather than just writing them in a policy that goes on a shelf somewhere that nobody looks at or is aware of. And so that's kind of the bare minimum, but that doesn't mean that you should stop there. You should definitely think about how this impacts company culture and prepares you against any employment issues or discrimination or litigation down the road. And so go ahead, Ryan.
And I'll hand this back to you in just a second, Adrian, but I just want to second what Andrew said. I've actually sat in depositions. I've been the defending attorney where leaders have been asked, when was the last time that you took sexual harassment training? Or when was the last time that you were trained on this issue? And that's a real question that people get asked in depositions. And I think it has a lot of, it can have a lot of weight in those types of cases. Let me just also add that as we get into a situation where companies have employees across the country, I do think it becomes difficult to say, well, I'm going to train my 3 employees in Washington on sexual harassment, but everyone else who lives in other states doesn't, I'm not going to train them on that issue. I think that's just not a practice that makes sense for companies. I don't think it makes sense culturally, and I don't think it makes sense legally. And as a trend, I'll also just say, we track these trends. We have a tool that helps companies as they hire people in new states, or as they have employees move from a state where a company has existing employees to new states. And so we're watching these kind of trends. We're updating these tools. I think you're going to see more and more states that are adopting sexual harassment training requirements. And we have seen that in past years. And I think that's the way the trend is going. And so I do think that companies, as they start to hire people who are dispersed across the country, really need to think hard about what they're going to do about sexual harassment training, even if they don't currently have people in those 6 states. And I think that's sort of a long-winded way of saying the same thing Andrew was saying on that. But I do think it's even more important now as we see our workforce footprint widening across multiple states for many companies.
Yeah, I guess to sum it up, if you had a problem and you said, did you train people on sexual harassment discrimination? The worst answer is, no, we didn't do that because it's not required.
Or we only trained our employees in Illinois and they lived in Iowa, so they didn't get the training.
Right. I think that really communicates how seriously a company takes an issue if they're only, training a certain subset of their employee population. I think that can be really tricky culture that you're creating.
Yes, I can see you lawyers turning around and saying, so you knew it was important because you did it in some states and you chose not to in others.
Right.
I know how you guys think.
It can be used against you.
There you go.
And so when it comes to creating these policies, equal opportunity policies and sexual harassment policies are some of the most common policies that we see companies implement because they are so foundational for both legal compliance and for company culture. And so these policies, companies need to think about what to include in these policies. Even the tone of the policy can really affect how they're consumed and understood by employees. And so creating equal opportunity policies means communicating to employees what are the protected classes. So there are protected classes under federal law, but then each state can also have protected classes, which means employers cannot discriminate against employees for hiring or any other aspect of employment, such as promotions, compensation, retention, anything like that in employment on the basis of these characteristics. And so there's federal requirements, but then there's also state protected characteristics, and each state might have a slightly different list. And we're seeing states revisit what's on these lists. And just recently, we've seen a couple states that have added new protected characteristics to them, which is traits typically associated with race, such as hair texture and protective hairstyles. And so even though these lists they date back a long way, we're still seeing movement on these lists that companies need to be aware of. What are protected classes and what protected classes affect our employee population, and making sure they're being expansive and inclusive of their definition of protected classes and where, on what's communicated in that policy. And the policies, both the equal opportunity and sexual harassment policies, should include clear methods of how to report this kind of violations to these policies, both where to report it, and then include a reporting form or direction to a reporting portal, or however the company tracks these kind of violations, making sure that's very clear and accessible to employees so that they can readily report anything that they're experiencing or even that they're witnessing in the workplace. As Andrew said, it's not just about being the victim, it's also about witnessing or being a bystander to these types of harassment or discrimination, and making sure employees know you should also communicate these violations. If you're witnessing this in any form of the workplace for any person, whether or not they're in your department or you have oversight over them, anything like that needs to be reported to the company so they can correct that. And then communicating how are these types of complaints investigated. Communicating that to employees helps them know that the company takes these seriously, has a clear way that they're going to handle these types of issues rather than doing it ad hoc when it comes to the company. But communicating to employees, okay, once the complaint is filed with the company will immediately review it and take any interim steps to stop the harassment or discrimination if it's still ongoing, or making sure that anything that needs to happen immediately is triaged. And then from there, what will the company do next? Will they interview anybody who's a witness to the discrimination or harassment? Making sure that documents are kept, records, any sort of evidence of the discrimination or harassment is retained by the company so that employees can know that this will be taken seriously and there is value in reporting this to make sure this kind of behavior isn't happening in the workplace, and that also the company won't retaliate against employees for reporting or participating in any form of an investigation, whether they're a witness to discrimination, harassment, or they're giving their testimony as what they experienced, or anything that the company might need help with to make sure that these are resolved and handled fair and thoroughly for employees. And then any additional help that employees can seek outside of the company. So internal investigations are one thing, but there's also government and administrative bodies that can help. In some instances, employees might need to involve the police and file a police report. And then also making sure they're aware that they could hire a lawyer and retain outside counsel if they feel they need to do so. So communicating all of that to employees can help them understand that this is something the company takes seriously, has a clear plan to prevent in the workplace. And then the training just enforces all of these components to employees, making sure they understand what is discrimination or harassment, what does it look like, how does it occur, and then what should they do if they're witnessing or experiencing that.
I'll just add one thing that goes back to, I think, a really important point that Andrew made with the Harvey Weinstein example, which is with bystanders. This no retaliation part of your policy, it really is key, both in the written policy and the training, because I think that's the reason that people don't come forward when they witness something that's inappropriate. I think people who are harassed or discriminated against also feel that, but I think that there's a feeling by third parties who may see that in the workplace. They may see something inappropriate occurring. There's a worry that if they come forward, if they rock the boat, they may be retaliated against. And the employment laws, protect those people. And it's very important, I think, both as a legal matter and a cultural matter, that companies say, this is unacceptable. You will not be retaliated against in any way for coming forward with what you think is a good faith complaint or concern about this type of behavior. And I think that really can make a huge difference in, addressing problems early on, instead of letting them, like the example that Andrew gave, go on for an extended period of time. So I think that's become really, really crucial.
No, all really, really good points. Let's go to the next slide. So we were talking about prevention of discrimination, harassment, and I like to characterize, to put things into big buckets, which I think is helpful to do sometimes. So that's kind of what you have to do or have not to do, right? Diversity, equity, inclusion is, like I said, the other side of the coin of things you should do. And so we do cover, what it means to be diverse, what it means to be equitable, and what it means to be inclusive. But really key is that, I mentioned this earlier, but it's worth repeating, that a company can only be inclusive. It's the behavior of the individuals. Making an inclusive company means there's a new hire and they don't look like me, they didn't come from my background, whatever, and I make a point of inviting them for a virtual cup of coffee or a real cup of coffee, or I go out to lunch with some people and we invite them along if we're all physically together. It's those inclusive behaviors that are really the goal of this type of training. And part of that is being empathetic, of course, and also that feeling of belonging, right? The expression that I've heard people use in recent years is, I can bring my whole self to work, right? That people, that no matter what they are, whether it's a question of gender identity or gender expression, that they feel they can come as who they are, and they don't have to be, they don't have to put a mask on. And that's really important to feeling good about where you go to work every day, either in person or virtually. And finally, the last point is also relatively new. Psychological safety. Maybe it's a term that's been around for a long time and it's new to me, but only about the past year has that been added to our training. And it's really kind of an anti-bullying thing. There are some laws about bullying, which we cover in the appropriate sections, but in terms of psychological safety, it means that you can speak up without worrying about someone saying that's a dumb idea, and whether it's a colleague or a superior, that people really feel that they are in a psychologically safe place. And if you think about it, right? I mean, if it's never happened to you where you didn't feel you could bring your whole self to work, you feel like you had to hide who you really were, or you didn't feel that you could speak up for risk of being ridiculed or something, those are really terrible feelings to have just in life. And if we can help reduce or increase people's feeling of belonging and increase the likelihood if you have a psychologically safe place to work, we think we've gone a long way toward helping build a more diverse, equitable, and inclusive workforce. Let's go on to the next slide.
I'll jump in here and take this slide, but I'll also add I think to Andrew's last point is not only I think is that a terrible feeling to have where you feel like you can't really share your ideas or yourself in your workplace, but I also think that it stifles creativity and really limits your ability to be effective in your job. And so I think in addition to just being wrong, and I think something that we want people not to have to experience, I also think that it hurts productivity and that there's a real business, that it makes business sense to really focus on these DEI policies. I'll say that it's interesting because DEI to me, as Andrew said, it's the flip side of sort of the anti-discrimination laws, but it also can be a legally tricky area where not everything is intuitive. And we have worked on creating different policy creation engines for some different types of forms and documents that companies may want to consider using in this area where, you know, you still have to be, I think, thoughtful about the way that you approach this. And those include, we have an assessment and action plan that helps companies to assess their current DEI program and to see where they may want to work on strengthening their program. We have a vision statement. A lot of companies have found that if they're able to articulate kind of what their vision is for their DEI program, that can be helpful. We have an anti-discrimination policy, and that's the policy that we've talked about earlier. One that we've gotten a lot of questions about is an affinity group policy. There are a lot of companies that are starting affinity group policies to help people feel more belonging, especially as they're spread out, where you maybe were able to find some people that shared interests or characteristics with you in a large office location where you worked. Now that you're working remotely, it can be harder to connect with those people. And so we have a lot of companies that are starting affinity group policies, but that's something that needs to be done carefully and thoughtfully as you're thinking about how you're going to do that. Candidate evaluation forms. This is where you get into things like unconscious bias. How are you trying to make your candidate evaluation objective rather than subjective? And, you know, what steps are you taking? And then exit interview forms. You know, when people are leaving your company, it's a time where they are most likely to be candid with you about why they're leaving. You know, many companies have people who leave on positive terms, but those people are willing to sort of express things that maybe were frustrating to them or that they had concerns about when they were an employee that they maybe weren't willing to talk about before they were leaving. And so we have exit interview forms. And so there are a lot of different policies and documents, I think, that can help you to put your DEI program into place and to do it correctly. Why don't we move to the next slide?
So let's move on to the third circle in our Venn diagram that we started with, which is data privacy and information security. So the first thing is to understand the difference between the two. So data privacy for us is all about protecting mostly your customer data. It can also be your colleague employee data as well, but for the most part, data privacy is about protecting the data of your customers, your vendors, et cetera. While information security is about keeping your system secure, right? So when someone clicks on a phishing email, that's an information security problem. When someone takes a thumb drive with customer data and takes it to a new job with them, that's a data privacy issue. Mm-hmm. So that's number one. Number two, what makes data privacy a tough topic in this country is there's very little federal law. There's the HIPAA law, which covers protected healthcare information, and but it's mostly a mishmash of state law. You know, California has I can't remember the CDPR for consumers that live in California and so on. So it's a mishmash of state law. So data privacy is really a collection of best practices that's really important to have your people embrace, because just like the reputational risk of having a problem with DEI or discrimination or harassment, having your customer data breached, even if you're a small company, can be a huge problem if people think that their data is out there. So best practice for data privacy is really critical. And the same thing for information security. You know, you talked about ROI. You know, what's the ROI on not getting struck by ransomware? Right, that's a huge problem. And it happens mostly in smaller companies, or you see a lot of times in like hospitals and cities, people that don't have a robust IT department don't keep their systems updated so that the vulnerabilities can be exploited. So those are the two different things. Data privacy is protecting the data, and information security is securing the systems. So those are two related but very different things. And of course, the training covers that, as well as your your policies, which we should flip to. And let's talk about the policies, because that says how you should handle your customers' data.
Yeah, thank you, Andrew. And I think I like how you sort of explained the patchwork when it comes to data privacy, because this is something that we monitor very closely. We provide different products that help companies to comply with state data privacy laws. So California came out with the first one, a confusing acronym, the CCPA. To make it more confusing, the CCPA is going to become the CPRA January 1st of this year. And so California sort of came out first with their data privacy law. And if we move to the next slide, we can talk a little bit more about this, and I'll have some information up. But the CCPA will become the CPRA in California. And then we had some other states follow suit. Virginia passed its own state privacy law, followed by Colorado. Virginia's will come online January 1st of this year, and Colorado will come online July 1st of 2023. And then just recently, within the last few months, Utah and Colorado passed their own data privacy laws. And so what we have is what has been described as a patchwork of data privacy laws. Instead of a federal law, we have California requiring one thing, Virginia requiring another, and Colorado requiring a third thing. And soon we'll have more examples. And I think that this is a trend, a growing trend, that we're going to see more states that are addressing data privacy with their laws. And so, we have a product that helps companies to create their data privacy policies, as well as their website notices, but also gives them the portals that they need on their website to be able to take their data protection requests. And so this is something that we're watching closely, but is really a key area for companies to think about, is what are they doing with their customers' data, whether they're subject to these laws or not. And then, as Andrew mentioned, how are they protecting that data? How are they protecting, the information that they have? And so not only do we help companies with domestic laws, in Europe, there's the GDPR, which is the General Data Privacy Regulation that covers data privacy. And so if you're a company that does business in Europe, you could very well be subject to the GDPR. We also have a tool that helps companies that do business in China with the PIPL as their privacy law. And so this is an area where different countries and different states are developing data privacy laws, and it's important to stay on top of what's happening and what's required. In addition, I think internal policies are important for data security, right? How are you protecting your systems? And we've had a lot of companies come and say, hey, we need a policy, for example, that explains what video conferencing systems we're going to allow people to use. Do we want them to be using only Zoom or WebEx or Google Meets, and so there are lots of different aspects to that I think are important. And then finally, this goes without saying, but as people work at home, they're taking their laptops home, they're taking documents home, they're taking company property home. And how are you monitoring that? What policies do you have around it? Are they able to use their laptop, their work laptop, for personal use? Those kind of policies are important for and not only generally to set expectations, but for information, protecting your information and your data protection. And then I guess the last one would just be a non-disclosure policy, right? It's important, I think, for employees to understand what they can share and what they can't share. And this is a lot on social media, right? I mean, what do you want your employees to be sharing about your company on social media, and what are things that actually need to be protected? I think a strong policy can help with that. So there are a lot of different areas, I think, of data privacy and information protection where a strong policy foundation really is an important step, along with training. The thing about these policies, I think, that can be difficult is sometimes they can be very technical. And I think that's really where Traliant's training comes in, to sort of show how you take technical policy language and actually put it into practice.
Well, that's great. Ryan, let's go on to the last slide and just kind of sum things up here because we're getting near the top of the hour. So I think that hopefully we've given you a good overview of not just the why you should do this training, why it's in your own, why you should do it because it's the right thing to do just humanistically, but also it's an important thing to protect your business, but that the integrated solution is really important. And it will help maintain and protect your reputation because the last thing you need is that, even if it's not in the press, it's just in social media, there's a complaint. It's a bad thing not to be able to, not to try to minimize that from the risk of that happening. We didn't talk about customer trust, but it is true. We have people asking us about how diverse our organization is and so on. So customers do care about your organization being diverse, equitable, inclusive. Certainly avoiding, legal action is, that's when things have really gone off the rails if there's an internal, external lawsuit. And then at the end of the day, it's about, when you take care of your employees, they take care of you and they take care of your customers. And increasing employee retention and satisfaction and, general satisfaction with you as an employer is really important to having a productive, successful, profitable organization.
Yeah, I would agree with everything there. I mean, I think that really companies need to be thinking about who they want to be as a company and the type of workplace that they want to create. And I think that training and a strong policy foundation are integral to that. That as companies think about the type of workplace they want to be, those are some of the first things that they should be thinking about. And I think that's important not only for productivity but for retention. And that's one of the reasons I was so excited about this webinar series together is that we have both the policies and the training, and I think that they really go hand in hand in sort of checking these boxes. So thank you. Oh, go ahead, Andrew. Sorry.
No, go ahead, Ryan. Go ahead.
I was just going to say, we're at the top of the hour. We have had some questions come in the Q&A that we've answered, but I was just going to add for those who may be interested in learning more about 650, you can visit our website at 650.com and you can request a free, no pressure demo of our products. Essentially, we create document generation engines that allow you to customize the documents you want. You answer a series of questions and it creates a document for you. And then we update those engines. And so as the law changes, as best practices change, we update those engines and we send out updates to you. So it makes it easy for you to keep your employee handbook, your employment agreements, or any of the other documents you've created up to date. And I'll hand it over to Andrew to explain how people can find out more about Traliant if they're interested in ordering training.
You can certainly go through, I believe we have a web page up now on the 650 site. Is that live now? So you can go there, or that's the best thing to do is go through the 650 because you want the benefit of the integrated solution, and that's really the power.
Yeah, awesome. And we'll send out that link in our follow-up email. But we want to thank everyone for joining us today. I think it's been a fun discussion. I appreciate the questions. And Andrew, I've really enjoyed presenting with you, and Adrian presenting with you again.
Yes, Adrian, Ryan, it's been a pleasure. Thank you all, and thank you all for attending today.